This is a presentation about a passage of text from the 1970 novel Zettel's Traum by German author Arno Schmidt. The passage occurs early on in the novel. In it, the main character and narrator, Dan, tells his companions about some of the local history of the region they're wandering through in bucolic Lower Saxony. In particular, here, Dan is telling the story of a 19th century poet who depicted the peasants in his poetry and was subsequently killed by them. A recording exists from 1969 of Arno Schmidt reading this passage, which I'll play in a moment. Listening carefully to how Schmidt reads in this recording, the speed, the cadences, the insertions, the emphases, it immediately raises several interesting questions and perhaps provides clues of some kind or other into how a reader might read Zettel's Traum. Here are some questions that Schmidt's reading raises. The nature of parenthetical thoughts and their representation in literature. We might think of these as thoughts that are nested, one within the other, submerged one below the other, or layered one on top of the other. Another question is how to read or not read the punctuation and the marginal notes. And this begs questions of how typography and layout function overall and how they affect reading. There are questions of voice, particularly the multiplicity of voices that a reader might imagine Dan to have. And finally, Schmidt's reading raises the question of citation and fantasy. I've set these two terms in opposition in order to attempt to capture a core dynamic of Zettel's Traum, which is the scholarly fastidiousness for accurate citation, in other words, the citation of sources to prove something is true or to substantiate a claim, and the conflation of that with pure fantasy. Throughout Zettel's Traum, we see Schmidt weaving a web of citations into a web of fantasy. So then, let's first take a look at this passage in English. The English translation by John Woods appears on screen. I will read through it now, though I'll be taking some liberties with Woods's translation based on my study of the rhythms of Schmidt's oral reading of the German. I'll be reading fast, like Schmidt does. I'll be imitating him. If you'd like to read Woods's translation before hearing my version, you can pause the video now and read through. So then, it must have been round about 120 years ago now, Wilma, that peasants, incited and aroused by the Pastor Lotzi, here, and demonstrating with my finger on the wood tap tap, here, buried a poet who often depicted them. And the fact itself cannot be doubted. I'll show you then, if you really, really want, the splendid relevant warrants of arrest in the Gazette of the Kingdom of Hanover. And accordingly, if you haven't had it up to there, even the greater part of his corpus, well, yeah, which needless to say, I am the owner of in rare totality. That'd be the Garden of Herrn von Rosenroth, my Uncle Nikolaus, the Castle in Hungary, in which the chess variations occur, fine things for the opening B2, B4, contribute lots. I've even been able to bring a couple of manuscripts into my collection. Yeah, around 1850. Poe time, exactly right. Here is the same passage in the original German from page 11 of Zettel's Traum, and a link to the recording of Arno Schmidt's reading. In lavender font, I've transcribed the insertions and alterations that I hear Schmidt making as he reads out loud. Pause now if you'd like to read through it before hearing Schmidt's recitation.
Also, es mögen nun wohl an die 120 Jahre her sein, Wilma, dass Bauern, aufgehetzt und angeschürt vom Pastor Lotzi, hier, und demonstrierend mit dem Finger ans Holz gedippt, hier, einen Dichter verscharrt haben, der sie öfters beschrieb. An dem Faktum selbst ist nicht zu zweifeln. Ich zeige euch dann, wenn ihr durchaus wollt, die herrlich einschlägigen Steckbriefe im Amtsblatt für das Königreich Hannover. Beziehungsweise, wenn ihr die Nase gar nicht voll kriegt, auch den größten Teil seiner Werke. Ja, die ich selbst in seltener Vollständigkeit besitze. Oder wer der Garten des Herrn von Rosenroth, mein Onkel Nikolaus, das Schloss in Ungarn, in dem Schachvarianten vorkommen. Feine Sachen, die zur Eröffnung B2, B4 viel beitragen. Ich habe sogar ein paar Manuskripte an mich bringen können. Ja, rund 1850, Poezeit, genau.
Now, with Schmidt's lilt and rolled R's ringing in our ears, we can correlate the rhythms of his recital with what he's chosen to set down on the printed page. How he wrote it versus how he voiced it, in other words. The result is a close reading of the passage, which bears on the question of the nature and structure of thoughts and their representation in the novel. Here again is the German text. Let's go line by line. Also, es möge nun wohl an die 120 Jahre her sein, Wilma. So then, it must have been round about 120 years ago now, Wilma. This unit of text establishes the time of the narrative around 1850, what Schmidt later in the passage calls Poezeit, or Poe era. In fact, Edgar Allan Poe died at the age of 40 in 1849, which would make 1850 the moment immediately after his death. Das Bauern, aufgehessen und angeschürt von Pastor Lotzi, hier, und demonstrieren mit dem Finger ans Holz getippt, hier, einen Dichter verscharrt haben, der sie öfters beschrieb. That peasants, incited and aroused by the Pastor Lotzi, here, and demonstrating with my finger on the wood tap tap, here, buried a poet who often depicted them. After establishing the time as 1850, Dan, the speaker, begins the main narrative about a poet who was killed by peasants. This narrative, however, is immediately interrupted by the apparent fear that his listeners might doubt the veracity of the tale he's telling. Ein Faktum selbst ist nicht zu zweifeln. Ich zeige euch dann, wenn ihr durchaus wollt, die herrlich einschlägigen Steckbriefe im Amtsblatt für das Königreich Hannover. And the fact itself cannot be doubted. I'll show you then, if you really, really want, the splendid relevant warrants of arrest in the Gazette of the Kingdom of Hanover. These are two parenthetical thoughts. First, the assertion that what he's saying is factual and therefore provable, followed by the citation of an actual archive of old regional arrest warrants as proof. The second half of this passage consists of what I'm calling narrative 2. So not the main train of thought about the poet being killed, but a related, secondary, perhaps tangential train of thought about the poet's works. Beziehungsweise, wenn er die Nase gar nicht voll kriegt, auch den größten Teil seiner Werke, wie ja die selbstredend seltene Vollständigkeit besitze. Oder wer der Garten des Deren von Rosenrot, mein Onkel Nikolaus, das Schloss in Ungarn, in dem die Schachvarianten vorkommen, feine Sachen zur Eröffnung B2 viel beitragen. Ich habe sogar ein paar Manuskripte an mich bringen können. Ja, rund 1850. Poezeit, genau. And accordingly, if you haven't had it up to there, even the greater part of his corpus, well, yeah, which needless to say, I am the owner of in rare totality. That'd be the Garden of Herren von Rosenrot, my Uncle Nikolaus, the Castle in Hungary, in which the chess variations occur, fine things for openings B2, B4, contribute lots. I've even been able to bring a couple of manuscripts into my collection. Yeah, around 1850. Poe time, exactly right. This is Dan's citation of his own collection of works by the village's mid-19th century poet. He first cites his rare complete collection, then he cites specific works by name, and ultimately he even cites a specific passage about chess from one of the works, Castle in Hungary. These citations go from general to specific, that is, from the archive to the works to a particular passage in one work. It's as if each subsequent thought burrows deeper into Dan's recollection of the poet's work until, having remembered this truly wonderful bit of writing about chess variations, his thoughts then return to the archive itself, its acquisition of manuscripts, and by implication, its quality and preeminence. What Dan is also apparently describing here is his collection of the writings of Arno Schmidt. The titles that he lists are in fact the names of early stories by Schmidt himself. This secondary narrative can therefore be read as a fantasy on the part of the author that he were writing in the middle of the 19th century rather than in the middle of the 20th, and indeed that he were persecuted and murdered by an angry mob for his art. Finally, the story concludes with a comment about the newly acquired manuscripts, as if in answer to an unspoken question about their dates of birth. Ja, rund 1850. Poezeit, genau. Yeah, around 1850. Poe time, exactly. This reestablishes the fantasy that the poet slain by peasants, who is none other than the great Arno Schmidt himself, was a contemporary of Edgar Allan Poe and, like Poe, died an untimely death. I've underlined these units of text with different colored lines, which go vertically from top to bottom. But it's possible to think about the structure of the passage horizontally also as a series of parenthetical insertions. All a parenthesis is, after all, is an insertion of an explanation, aside, or afterthought. First, the passage opens by establishing the time as Poezeit. Then comes the first narrative about the poet being killed. This part contains one parenthetical explanation about incitement by the Pastorlozi and one parenthetical aside from Dan, the narrator, describing the tapping gesture that he makes by way of indicating where the poet was buried. Next comes the citation of the arrest warrants as promise that the story is true. Ultimately, mention of the poet's death propels Dan into a reverie about the poet's body of work. This second narrative, already subsidiary to the main story of the poet's death, is itself a series of afterthoughts. First, Dan brags about the rarity of the archive. Then he lists some of its choicest and hardest to find early works. Then he relives a specific microscopic moment from one particular story, which depicts the opening of a chess game. Then this reverie of the chess game breaks off in order for the train of thought to reemerge from the paragraph back to the bookshelf, as it were, or from the passage back to the archive. And finally, this passage recovers some semblance of balanced parenthetical structure by reemerging one step further toward what appears now to have been the main train of thought all along, that this local poet, who by the way is Arno Schmidt, is a Poe figure from the timeline of his life to the mysterious circumstances of his sensational death. Continuing to reconcile what Schmidt wrote with how he recited it, we turn now from the structure of successive thoughts to the content and function of punctuation and marginal notes. That is, what does the way in which Schmidt reads tell us about his typographic experiments? In order to hear or see what the punctuation might be indicating, we can examine two aspects of the oral reading. First, we will look at the oral additions, that is, the places where Schmidt adds something while reading aloud that is not present in the written text. And second, we will look at the rhythms, and particularly the pauses that Schmidt articulates, and what they tell us as an interpretation or performance of the written script. But first, let's address the oral additions, the 6 of which you can see written here between the lines and highlighted in lavender. Let's look at each of them. First, Schmidt appends Wilma to the end of the first sentence, meaning Wilma is the person to whom the story or lecture is principally, though not exclusively, addressed. Second, before bragging about the rarity of his archive's completeness, Schmidt exhales sharply with a sort of self-satisfied scoff, which I've transcribed as wie ja. Wie ja, die ich selbstredend seltene Vollständigkeit besitze, Schmidt proudly declares. Oral additions 3 and 4 go together. Number 3 is Schmidt remembering how gloriously he depicted the details of the opening moves of that chess game from Castle in Hungary, which, by the by, is among Schmidt's most obscure writings, if not the most obscure thing he ever wrote. Apparently, Schmidt refers elsewhere to the Castle in Hungary as one of his earliest unpublished fragments of novellas. So it's as good as impossible to ever read, but yet Schmidt inserts the words feine Sachen, meaning fine things for the opening, and then adds viel beitragen, or contribute lots, as if there were so much to say in redescribing this riveting chess scene. Schmidt really appears to be relishing the memory of this old story, though even if moving a pawn from b2 to b4 doesn't in itself constitute the most dazzling of opening chess stratagems. Additionally, viel beitragen corresponds to both an ellipsis in the punctuation and also a note in the right margin that shows the pawn moving one step farther to b5 in the second move. This is a marginal note which, interestingly, Schmidt does not read aloud. Viel beitragen almost sounds like a reminder from Schmidt to himself to include a marginal note that did not yet exist, one with more examples of the brilliant chess moves that no one would ever read about. Editions 5 and 6 also go together. Schmidt reads, ja, rund 1850, Po-Zeit, genau, or yeah, around 1850, Poe era, exactly. And by adding ja to the beginning of the phrase and genau to the end, he strikes a conversational tone, as if perhaps responding to the nonverbal communication of his audience as represented by punctuation marks. For example, we might imagine that the bit of punctuation just before the word ja represents Dan's audience responding with body language to the prospect that these newly acquired manuscripts, as if to say, with dawning realization, wait a second, what time period did you say this poet was from? That's right, Dan responds. Yes, 1850, the era of our beloved literary idol, Edgar Allan Poe. Bingo. This slide highlights two elements. First, you can see Schmidt's 6 oral editions, which are in lavender, as in the previous slides. And second, you can see underlined in yellow instances of a unit of punctuation that I think of as the dash colon. In the coming slides, I will speculate about the dash colon's potential to function both rhythmically as a rest in the rhythmic transcription of Schmidt's oral reading and as a punctuative stop in the text, occurring before the start of a new phrase or idea. For the moment, just notice in the 6 yellow boxes how the dash colon precedes the onset of a new phrase. It almost looks like an analog to the get set command at the beginning of a race. Schmidt is on his mark, and then the dash colon calls for him to get set. As Professor Elkins notes, however, Schmidt would have been using a monospace typewriter, so every double space here is also significant. Part of my project was to learn the rhythm and cadence of Schmidt's recitation by memorizing and mimicking it, and ultimately then transcribing it in musical notation. After completing my transcription, I gradually begin to think of the dash colon as a sort of pickup note, but not quite. Because a pickup note in music is an actual note that precedes the downbeat of a phrase, but with the dash colon, it's more like a silent pickup note to the pickup note. One term for this in both music and verse is anacrusis, but in both definitions, the word refers to unstressed notes or syllables. Here, however, the syllable is silent. In a more florid frame of mind, we might imagine the dash colon as the drawing in of breath before giving voice to an utterance, or the poise of the conductor's hands before the motion that releases the sound. Here on the left is my rhythmic transcription of Schmidt's oral reading. If you'd like to take a closer look at a JPEG of this transcription, please visit the link in the video description. This notation isn't perfect, but it attempts to show both the words and punctuation side by side with a corresponding rhythm. Assigning rhythmic value to punctuation, though, forces decisions to be made about whether to voice the punctuation or assign it to a rest. In this passage, none of the punctuation is voiced, meaning my sheet music doesn't call for any of the punctuation to make any sounds. It's therefore difficult to characterize the dash colon as a particular type of silence. But looking back at my notation, I can see in 2 of the 5 instances that the dash colon, as I had placed it, was alone squarely under a dotted quarter rest. In one other instance, it appeared along with contiguous punctuation beneath a 16th note rest. In 2 instances, I had overlapped the dash colon with the rhythmic notes of Schmidt's oral editions, though I see now that it might more plausibly belong to the pauses between the phrases, as I've indicated here with red arrows. And in the last instance, at bottom right, I failed altogether to account for the pause in Schmidt's phrasing as he performs the dash colon of the last line. Ja, 158 get set, Podzeit, genau. The dash colon may well function for Schmidt as a particular kind of common stop. However, there's another interpretation that I would be remiss not to mention. Because Zettel's Traum is a novel as relentlessly obsessed with sexual behavior as it is with mining written language for the sexual secrets it supposedly conceals, it must be said, therefore, that the dash colon is also a pictogram of a penis and testicles. Could Arno Schmidt have possibly failed to notice this as he spent years typing thousands of them into this novel? If the rhythm of Schmidt's reading gives us a clue about the dash colon as an indication of duration, his oral editions might tell us something about the variety of ways in which larger punctuation units function. For example, if we think of the punctuation underneath the word via as a scoff, then the dash, parentheses, question mark, parentheses, dash colon before the words die-ish represent a puff of air or a kind of grunt on the part of the narrator. Ja, die ich selbstredend in seltener Vollständigkeit besitze. On the other hand, as we've already seen, punctuation might also represent gestures. In the example bottom left, a possible gesture of incredulity or quizzicality on the part of the listeners is answered by the affirmation ja, 158. Or again, we see the punctuation functioning intertypographically, which is to say that the typographic elements refer to each other. An example of this is the ellipsis that overlaps with the words viel beitragen, which refers the reader to the note in the right margin. Throughout Zettel's Traum, Schmidt uses punctuation experimentally to represent duration, gesture, cognitive states, pictures, sounds, tactile sensations. In many cases, the punctuation could be operating along several of these valences at once, which means that it remains ambiguous. Furthermore, how consistent or systematic Schmidt was in his deployment of certain formulations, like the dash colon or the parenthetical question mark, is not clear, and speculations must therefore remain inconclusive. Zettel's Traum is a novel with many verbatim citations and many marginal notes, and this raises the question of voice. How many voices does Dan have? And which voice is thinking or saying or writing the text that we're reading in any given moment? This issue is further complicated here by the fact that the recording presents us with Arno Schmidt's actual voice. And as we've already observed, the line between Dan's voice and Schmidt's can become quite blurry. When is Dan acting in his capacity as narrator of the story, and when in his capacity as writer of the novel we're reading? When is he giving voice to his inner monologue, and when is he lapsing into Schmidt's voice? Here's an outline of the possible voices at play when Schmidt recites this passage. First, there's Arno Schmidt, reading in the voice of Dan the character, who oscillates between A, the voices of Dan the narrator, B, the voice of an inner monologue, and C, Schmidt's own voice as it comes through in Dan's thoughts and comments. Looking at the quotation marks in this passage shows where Dan the character starts and stops speaking. As you can see, he stops speaking only briefly after the word here, where the quotation marks close and Dan, the narrator of Zettel's Traum, inserts a description of his own tapping gesture, meant to indicate where the poet was buried. In the rhythmic notation, you can see that Schmidt zips through 13 syllables in the space of 3 beats. Here, und demonstrieren mit dem Finger ans Holz getippt, here. In the audio recording, you can hear how rapid this line is recited and how parenthetical it is to Dan's telling of the main story, which is, das Bauern hier einen Dichter verscharrt haben. The peasants here buried a poet. Dan is the narrator of the novel, but he's also the narrator of the story his character is telling in the novel. And we see this narrative voice in another parenthetical remark, this time within the quotation marks. Here, Dan remarks about the peasants being incited and aroused by the Pastor-Lotzi. This is Dan the character narrating aloud the reactions of the peasants in the story he's telling. Using the quotation marks to determime when a character is speaking versus when the narrator is narrating implies that interpretations of punctuation are also subject to whether they fall inside or outside of the quotation marks. For example, after Dan says he's acquired a couple of manuscripts, the quotations close. There follow 6 punctuation marks before the quotations open up again. Might we imagine these 6 punctuation marks to be a cognitive comment by the novel's narrator? The second type of voice we glimpse in this passage is that of Dan's inner monologue. This is the idea that his voice is characterized by a series of involuntary and passing thoughts that are running through his mind. The inner monologue appears to be at work with the mention of Castle and Hungary, which triggers Dan's thoughts of the story's chess game. That, in turn, triggers the memory of specific chess moves, which Schmidt praises in his oral reading as fine things for the opening, before inserting the words contribute lots, which flags this as a spot where the monologue could be expanded. And indeed, the right marginal note does just that. Finally, it's worth noting that the moments in which we can hear Schmidt's voice as it comes through in Dan's voice. It's worth noting the moments in which we can hear Schmidt's voice as it comes through in Dan's voice. In the audio recording, this would be Schmidt as voiced by Dan, as voiced by Schmidt. The translator John Woods says that there are signals or language cues that Dan/Schmidt is gliding into another position of narration in which the elements of Schmidt's biography take on greater interpretive significance. I see Dan's boast about owning the rare complete works of the poet as just such a signal. When he refers to the works that I own in rare totality, one wonders, is this Dan's voice claiming to uniquely own everything that Schmidt ever wrote? Or is it Schmidt's voice? Now, after looking at the passage's structure, typography, and voice in light of Schmidt's oral reading, I'd like to say a word about citation and fantasy. There are 2 main citations in this passage. The first one is to the Steckbriefe im Amtsblatt für das Königreich Hannover, or the warrants of arrest in the Gazette of the Kingdom of Hanover. This citation is meant as evidence of the fact that Dan's story cannot be doubted. However, no amount of poring over the actual warrants will yield the details of the death of the author of the Garten des Herren von Rosenrot. The citation here doesn't heighten the veracity of the story, but rather the vividness of the fantasy. The other citation in this passage is to the complete works of Arno Schmidt that Dan owns in rare totality. This is a citation, of course, to a real body of work, which fleshes out the notion that the poet killed by peasants in 1850 had the same body of written work as the actual Arno Schmidt. Here, as in the last example, the citation doesn't anchor the text to any actual reality, but instead works to enhance the concreteness of the fantasy, which, as we listen to the recording, sounds more like Schmidt's fantasy than Dan's. In conclusion, I'd like to comment on the paradox that Schmidt's oral reading presents. He's reading way too fast to apprehend all, or maybe even most of the information in the text. So as a readerly model, it's unsustainable. Yet at the same time, his recitation is also the performance of his script, which enables the oral and written versions to be compared. That's what I've attempted to do with my microscopic reading of these 13 lines from page 11. But this is also unsustainable, as Zettel's Traum is a dauntingly long book, and dwelling too long on any one passage has its risks. In the end, though, the issues of structure, typography, voice, and citation are complex, ongoing puzzles throughout Zettel's Traum. And that may be reason enough to keep reading. Thank you.